I tell stories inspired by power, silence, and human choices. This is one of them. She thought she broke a glass. She didn't know she broke her entire life. Because in that mansion, mistakes were not forgiven. They were buried. It was a quiet evening at the mansion, an evening that would unknowingly mark the beginning of a lifelong tragedy. The house, grand and silent under the weight of wealth, echoed with the distant hum of a world that would never understand the people who lived within it. The billionaire, a man whose name was whispered in awe and envy across the city, sat in his office, surrounded by papers, deals, and fleeting moments of power. But out of sight in the servants' quarters, a different kind of tension simmered. Sarah, the maid, had worked in the mansion for years, long enough to know the housey rhythm, its pulse. She knew when the master would entertain guests, when the staff would be overworked, and when the world outside would turn its back on her. She had always been invisible to the rich, just another face behind a polished silver tray, just another voice lost in the shuffle of opulence. But she never complained. She had her reasons for staying, reasons that went beyond the paycheck. That evening, a mistake was made, one so small, yet devastating. A glass, delicate as the world around her, slipped from Sarah's trembling hands. It shattered across the marble floor, its sharp edges piercing the silence of the grand hall. The billionaire's guests, seated in the dining room, did not hear the crash, but he did. And just like that, the world changed. As Sarah knelt, her heart racing, the master of the house appeared. His face was impassive, cold, a man so used to perfection that even the smallest flaw felt like a personal affront. His eyes briefly flicked over the scene, the glass shards glittering on the floor like shards of her life being destroyed. And in that moment, something inside him hardened. The maid's presence no longer mattered. He wasn't angry, he was dismissive. The glass in his mind represented the collapse of the world he had worked so hard to build. He couldn't bear to lose control over even the smallest detail. "Fix it," he said, his voice indifferent, as if her pain, her guilt meant nothing. But Sarah didn't move. She was frozen in place, her gaze locked on the broken pieces at her feet. In her mind, the world spun. She knew what would come next, how her one mistake, her one misstep, would be turned into something far worse than a shattered glass. And then, the door opened. The conversation that followed, hushed and urgent, sealed her fate. The incident, small, almost forgettable in the eyes of the world, became her burden to bear. The blame was placed on her, and in that moment, she understood the cruel truth. It was over. The billionaire's words, though quiet, carried more weight than she could bear. "Fix it," he had said, and she would, at any cost. The first crack in her loyalty had formed, but she was too caught in the storm to see it. The viewer is left with a chilling realization. How far will Sarah go to protect herself, to keep her job? And what kind of man would allow an innocent woman to bear a punishment she did not deserve? The billionaire's indifference had already sown the seeds of a deeper, more dangerous conflict. Sarah had always been a woman of quiet resilience. Her life, long before she stepped into the mansion's grand halls, had been one of survival. Raised in a small, cramped apartment in the city's poorest district, she learned early that the world didn't care for people like her. Every decision, every choice she made, had been driven by the need to stay afloat, to protect her family, to survive. There was no room for mistakes in a life like hers, and no one ever handed you second chances. When she first came to work for the billionaire, it had seemed like an impossible dream. The mansion was everything her humble life wasn't: luxury, order, and perfect presentation. For years, she had kept her head down, silently grateful for the steady paycheck, the warm meals, the security she never had growing up. But beneath the polished exterior, the mansion was a gilded cage, one where the staff were as invisible as the air they breathed. And yet, Sarah endured. Her loyalty to the job, to the family she had come to care for, particularly the young children, was unwavering. She knew this was her only shot at something better, even if the price was her silence, her submission. But now, this moment, this one small mistake, had shattered everything. As Sarah sat in the dimly lit servants' quarters that night, her mind raced with fear and shame. She had taken the fall. She had accepted the blame for something that wasn't her fault. The broken glass, the spilled wine, the angry outburst from the billionaire, it had all been too much. And still, she didn't speak up. Why? It wasn't just about the job, or even the mansion. It was about survival. She feared what would happen if she spoke up. The billionaire's wrath was a thing of legend in the industry. and one wrong move could cost her not just her job but her future. What would she have left without this? The truth seemed so far out of reach. Besides, who would believe her? In a world where the rich could do no wrong and the poor were easily discarded, she knew her voice meant nothing. So, she stayed silent. As she sat in the dark, feeling the weight of her decision pressing down on her, she understood the stakes. It wasn't just a glass that had been broken. It was her spirit, her sense of justice. And yet, there was no escape, no choice. The billionaire had won. He had forced her to choose between the truth and her livelihood. And in that moment, she chose to disappear. The viewer is left with a painful truth. In a world built on power and wealth, sometimes survival means sacrificing everything that makes you human. And the cost? It's far greater than anyone could imagine. In the days that followed the incident, the billionaire's life returned to its usual rhythm. The mansion, ever so pristine, continued to reflect the image of perfection he had built. The glass was swept away, the floor polished, and the world outside marveled at the empire he controlled with iron precision. For him, the incident was already a distant memory, another small inconvenience easily buried under layers of wealth and success. He spent his days in meetings with investors, shaking hands with men and women whose lives were dictated by numbers on a screen. His empire was expanding, bigger offices, bigger yachts, bigger deals. Everything was bigger, better, and more prestigious. But the cost of that success was invisible to him. It was buried in the shadows, tucked away behind walls of opulence and power. He had no interest in the people who had helped him get there, no regard for the workers who had sacrificed their lives to fuel his rise. The maid, her name already fading from his mind, was just another face in a sea of invisible servants. Yet, as he walked through the halls of his mansion, his kingdom, there was something nagging at the edges of his mind, a sense of unease. It wasn't the maid. No, he had long since written her off as a mere pawn in his world. But something wasn't right. The numbers, the projections, they weren't adding up the way they should. The stock prices were fluctuating in ways that made him nervous. His power, the very thing he had spent decades building, seemed a little less solid than it once had. It wasn't enough to break his stride, though. He pushed those thoughts aside. Money, status, control, these were the things that mattered. The maid's sacrifice, the broken glass, were nothing more than a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of his empire. In fact, he didn't even bother to check on her. His indifference was a shield, protecting him from any sense of responsibility. If she had left, so be it. There were always others willing to fill the roles of the invisible, those who would remain silent, those who would sacrifice for the price of survival. But as the days turned into weeks, a deeper truth began to reveal itself. His world, though seemingly flawless, was cracking. The people who worked for him were not as easily controlled as he thought. The cracks in his empire, the ones he dismissed as mere annoyances, were slowly spreading. He was blind to the quiet storm building just beneath the surface. The viewer, now filled with growing disdain for the billionaire, is left wondering, will his arrogance blind him to the coming storm? And how much longer can the weight of his empire rest on the backs of those he's discarded? The imbalance of power is palpable, and it's only a matter of time before it all unravels. After the incident, Sarah's life seemed to collapse in slow motion. The mansion, once a place of false comfort, had become a reminder of her broken trust. She never returned to work, her duties as a maid quietly erased, as if she had never existed in that world of marble floors and golden chandeliers. But the pain of betrayal clung to her, thick and heavy, like the weight of 1,000 broken promises. She had been discarded. Her loyalty had meant nothing. Her sacrifice? Just another transaction in the billionaire's world, easily forgotten the moment it was no longer useful. Yet, as she walked away from the mansion that had both sheltered and imprisoned her, a part of her still clung to the hope that somehow she could rebuild. She could make things right. But the path forward wasn't as simple as she had imagined. Without a job, without a steady income, Sarah had to return to the life she thought she had escaped, a life of uncertainty. She moved into a small, dingy apartment, the walls thin and the air stale. There, in the quiet of her new life, she struggled to sleep, the weight of guilt gnawing at her. She hadn't just lost her job. She had lost herself. The woman who had been full of hope and quiet dreams now found herself trapped in a spiral of bitterness and regret. Her days were spent searching for work, but the doors she knocked on were often closed, one after another. The silence of rejection was deafening. In a world where status mattered more than integrity, where the wealthy and powerful moved freely while the poor were stuck beneath their feet. Sarah had become invisible again. The same people who once walked past her as if she didn't exist were now the ones denying her a second chance. And yet, there were moments when she would catch a glimpse of her reflection in a store window and see something new in her eyes. There was fire there, a spark that had been dimmed but not extinguished. She had endured far worse than this. She had survived betrayal, and now she was learning how to survive on her own terms. Her dignity, though bruised, remained intact. She refused to become a victim, even if the world wanted her to be one. But the bitterness was hard to ignore. Every time she thought of the billionaire, her anger flared. He had been the one to crush her hopes. He had been the one to treat her like a piece of glass, shattered, discarded, and forgotten. And yet, he continued to thrive, his empire growing larger by the day, untouched by the consequences of his actions. He had built his life on the backs of people like her, and he never even knew her name. As the weeks passed, Sarah's resentment deepened. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was beginning to feel something darker, a desire for justice, for retribution. The knowledge that the billionaire had never cared about her, never once considered the cost of his indifference, stoked the flames of her rage. But with that rage came a realization. She would never get her dignity back by staying in the shadows. The truth had to be exposed. She knew she couldn't stay quiet forever. Not now. The tension between her desire for peace and the growing need for justice was reaching its breaking point. Something had to give. The viewer is left wondering, how far would Sarah go to seek revenge? Could she remain strong in her pursuit of dignity, or would the weight of her anger and betrayal pull her into a darker path? The stakes have never been higher, and the real battle is just beginning. The billionaire had always been a man of certainty. His empire, built on calculated risks and ruthless ambition, had flourished beyond his wildest dreams. He controlled everything: money, people, power. Nothing ever seemed beyond his grasp. But recently, small cracks had begun to form, so faint they were almost imperceptible, yet undeniable once noticed. At first, it was just rumors. Whispers behind closed doors in boardrooms, hushed conversations in the city's most exclusive clubs. Investors were jittery, uncertain. They spoke of a series of business failures. Small, yes, but accumulating. Deals that had once seemed solid were now falling apart. Contracts were canceled. Relationships were strained. The market was no longer responding to his every move. The billionaire brushed it off, of course. He always did. A misstep here, and there was nothing new. It was part of the game. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the sense that something bigger was lurking just beyond his control. His usual calm demeanor began to crack, just slightly. He found himself staring at the headlines of financial reports, unable to silence the gnawing feeling that his empire might not be as invincible as he once believed. Then, there were the rumors of his personal life, stories of affairs, broken friendships, and a distant, cold demeanor that was turning his once loyal circle of allies into a sea of distance and distrust. His wife, once his most vocal supporter, now looked at him with an air of quiet disillusionment. The social events he used to host with grandeur became more subdued. The perfect image of the billionaire's life was beginning to fray at the edges, like a silk thread pulled too tight. Meanwhile, miles away, Sarah was learning that the world had a strange way of exposing the hidden truths. Whispers of her past, the incident at the mansion, began to surface. At first, it was just idle gossip, a murmur in the background of a world that never really saw her. But as weeks passed, it grew louder. People who had once been strangers to her now seemed to know more about her life than she cared to admit. Her reputation, once quiet and unremarkable, was being pulled into the light. She hadn't said a word, yet somehow the truth was slipping out. And in that moment, the maid realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The billionaire's indifference wasn't the only thing that had cost her everything. His empire, his wealth, his control, they were all fragile. Everything could crumble with the right push. The tension was mounting. Neither knew just how deep the seeds of doubt had already taken root, but they were about to find out. The viewer is left on edge. How will these two seemingly disconnected paths intersect? And who will emerge victorious in the battle between truth and power? The quiet storm is building, and neither side will escape unscathed. The truth, like water, always finds a way to seep through cracks, no matter how deep they are buried. For Sarah, the moment of reckoning came unexpectedly, a flicker in the shadows of the billionaire's world that no amount of money or power could keep hidden. The first crack appeared quietly, almost innocuously, when an old security tape from the mansion resurfaced, left untouched for years in a forgotten archive. It had been a simple footage showing the moment of the incident. But for the first time, someone had looked closely at the tape. Someone had noticed something that no one else had bothered to see. The footage revealed what Sarah had known all along. The truth was never hers to carry. The real culprit had been someone else entirely, someone with more power and more influence than she had ever been allowed to know. The maid had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, framed for a crime she had not committed. The evidence, the proof, was now irrefutable. He was ready to reveal everything he had seen, everything he had known, and the burden of silence he had carried for far too long. As the world began to buzz with the news, the billionaire's empire started to feel the tremors. News outlets, once eager to sing his praises, now reported on the growing scandal, the hints of corruption, and the whispers of his involvement in something far darker than anyone had imagined. His perfect image, the immaculate brand he had worked so hard to create, was beginning to crack. His wealth, which had once shielded him from the consequences of his actions, was now failing to protect him from the truth. For Sarah, the truth felt both like a weight lifted and a burden renewed. She had always known the truth, but it had been her silence that had cost her everything. Now, it seemed the world would finally hear it. The question, however, was what to do with this knowledge. Should she let it come out on its own? Let the billionaire's empire crumble under the weight of its own lies and greed? Or should she step forward, exposing herself to the world once again, this time with a voice that no one could ignore? The dilemma was suffocating. Sarah had learned over the years to live with her silence, to bear the weight of the injustice with quiet dignity. But now, with the truth at her fingertips, the choice was hers. She could ruin the billionaire's life, bring his empire to its knees, and yet, at what cost to her own soul? The rage inside her was undeniable, but so was the fear. Exposing the truth meant returning to a world she had fought so hard to escape, a world where she had already lost everything. The stakes were higher than ever. The billionaire's empire was beginning to crumble under the pressure. But the bigger question remained. Would Sarah be the one to bring it down, or would she allow fate to do the work for her? The tension was unbearable. Sarah's decision was the turning point, the moment where everything would change. The viewer was left on the edge of their seat, wondering, what will Sarah choose? Will she embrace her own truth and confront the billionaire, or will she let the pieces fall into place on their own? The final confrontation was drawing near, and the world would never be the same again. The downfall began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. One failed deal led to another. One disgruntled investor followed another. At first, the billionaire tried to brush it off as mere coincidence, just the ebb and flow of high-stakes business. But soon, it was undeniable. His empire, which had once seemed unshakable, was crumbling piece by piece. His once legendary reputation, carefully crafted over decades, was now in tatters. His stock plummeted, investors pulled out, and once loyal employees began jumping ship. Every public appearance became a reminder of his past mistakes. Every word he spoke now scrutinized with suspicion. The billionaire, who had always projected an image of invulnerability, now seemed to be a mere shadow of himself. His once flawless demeanor began to crack in public, his calm and collected facade faltering under the weight of the mounting pressure. In private, the stress was unbearable. He could no longer rely on his money to shield him from the consequences of his actions. The truth was coming to light, and it was dragging him down with it. In the midst of his unraveling world, the maid, Sarah, watched from the sidelines, torn between a desire for justice and the temptation of revenge. The truth had come out, and now everyone knew what had happened. The evidence was clear. The witnesses were speaking. Yet Sarah remained on the outskirts, her emotions a swirling storm of anger, sadness, and betrayal. She had been waiting for this moment, watching as the billionaire's empire began to fall apart. But she hadn't yet made her move. The decision was hers, whether to step forward and claim the truth, to confront the man who had ruined her life, or to let him sink under the weight of his own hubris. Part of her wanted to see him destroyed, to watch him suffer as she had. But another part of her, the part that had kept her silent for so long, wondered if revealing the full extent of the truth would finally give her the closure she so desperately needed. Every step the billionaire took seemed to bring him closer to a reckoning, and Sarah, though she had been silent all this time, was now more connected to his fall than ever. The billionaire had always lived in the belief that his money and power could protect him from the consequences of his actions. But the world he had built was crumbling, and nothing he had could save him now. The tension between them was palpable. The billionaire fighting to keep his empire intact, and Sarah watching from the sidelines, considering whether to expose the truth once and for all. Would she rise up and bring him down, or would she let the chips fall where they may? The stakes had never been higher. The billionaire was losing control of everything, and the one person who had the power to destroy him was standing at the edge, torn between justice and vengeance. The viewer is left on the edge of their seat, wondering how much longer the billionaire can hold on. Will Sarah take the final step and destroy him once and for all, or will she let him face the consequences of his actions on his own? The tension is building, and the answer is just around the corner. The air was thick with tension, each breath carrying the weight of years of silence and unspoken truths. Sarah stood in the grand office of the billionaire, the man who had once towered over her like a god, and now seemed smaller than ever. The sprawling view of his empire, once a symbol of his unassailable power, felt distant, almost irrelevant, as the two of them faced each other. The world outside was unaware of the storm brewing inside this room, a storm that was about to change everything. Do you really think you can just erase it all? Erase me? Sarah's voice cut through the silence, steady and cold. The billionaire, his face pale, looked at her in disbelief. For the first time in years, he was unable to hide the fear in his eyes. His mouth opened, but no words came. He was speechless, caught in a moment he could not escape, a moment that had been long overdue. You took everything from me, Sarah continued, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with raw, unfiltered emotion. You used me, discarded me, all because of your pride, your reputation, your empire. Her eyes burned with fury, yet the pain in them was undeniable. The billionaire stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been the one in control. He had always been the one to pull the strings, to make people bow to him. But now, in the presence of the woman he had betrayed, all that power felt meaningless. The stories, the lies, the manipulation, none of it mattered anymore. All that was left was the truth, and the truth was undeniable. I never wanted to be your enemy, Sarah said, her voice low, almost mournful. But you made me one. And now you'll face what you've done. Her words hung in the air, pregnant with the weight of the years of injustice. She had never intended for this moment to feel so much like a triumph. The years of pain, the memories of his coldness, of the lies, of the humiliation, it all coalesced into something powerful. She wasn't just confronting him anymore. She was confronting everything he represented. He had thought that money could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now, faced with the reality of his past, he realized how wrong he had been. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was powerless. The irony was not lost on her, how he had once dismissed her as nothing more than a cog in his machine. And now she stood before him, the one who held the power to bring it all down. You thought I was just a maid, a nobody, but I was always more than that. And now you'll understand that. He reached out, his hand trembling, as if trying to find some last vestige of control. Please, he begged, his voice cracking. Don't do this. You don't know what you're doing. But Sarah was no longer the woman who had once stood by, silenced by fear and loyalty. She was no longer the one who had been discarded, left in the shadows. She was no longer the woman who had been broken by his cruelty. She had taken back her power, and now there was no turning back. You took everything from me, she repeated, her eyes cold. Now it's my turn. The billionaire staggered again, his empire, his entire world shattering around him. And Sarah? She stood there, unwavering. The reckoning had arrived. The billionaire's empire was falling, and it was all because of him. In that moment, everything shifted. She had made him face what he had done. And now, standing at the center of it all, Sarah held the truth. She held justice. But the question remained, would this moment of reckoning lead to redemption? For her? For him? Or would it simply be the final blow in a world built on lies and betrayal? And no matter what came next, she would never be silenced again. The day the billionaire's empire fell felt almost anticlimactic, like a house of cards slowly collapsing, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but rubble. For the first time in years, he was alone in the cold, sterile office he had once felt invincible in. Every call was another reminder of the damage he had caused. His reputation had been destroyed. He had no allies, no one to turn to. In the silence of the office, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. All the years of manipulation, the lies, the coldness toward the people who had served him, everything came rushing back. But it was too late. The consequences had already arrived, and there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. He thought of Sarah, her face seared into his memory from that final confrontation. She had not only taken back her power, she had stripped him of his. It was a power he had never even realized he had surrendered until now. He had always thought of her as nothing more than an expendable part of his life, a servant who would never dare challenge him. How wrong he had been. He thought of the years she had spent suffering in silence, carrying the weight of a betrayal she hadn't deserved. And in the quiet of his crumbling world, he realized how utterly alone he was. The people he had once trampled on had moved on, and now the consequences of his own choices were all that remained. The money, the prestige, it had never been enough to shield him from this. And now, all of it was gone. Meanwhile, Sarah, for the first time in years, felt a sense of relief. The truth had come out, and she had done what she had promised herself she would do. The billionaire had been exposed for the fraud he was, and her sacrifice, her years of silence, had finally meant something. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long had been lifted, and yet it was impossible to feel victorious. She had lost something, too, her innocence, perhaps, or the part of her that had still believed in some kind of justice. The billionaire was broken, but she wasn't sure if she felt better for it. Her heart ached as she walked through the empty streets, the echoes of her past decisions reverberating in her mind. Now that the truth was out, there was an emptiness, a sense of finality. She had won, yes, but at what cost? Her path ahead was unclear. The relief she had expected to feel was tinged with melancholy. She had fought for justice, but it came with a weight she hadn't anticipated. She had torn down the empire that had once oppressed her, but in the process, had she lost something of herself in the process? The billionaire's empire had crumbled, but both of their worlds had been irrevocably changed. For him, it was the destruction of everything he had once prized. For her, it was the beginning of a new chapter, but one marked by the scars of her past. The emotional release was real, but it was bitter. In the end, justice had been served, but redemption? Redemption was still out of reach for both of them. And as the billionaire sat alone in his office, surrounded by the remnants of his lost empire, and Sarah walked through the streets, her footsteps echoing in the night, both were left with the same haunting question. Was this really the end, or was it just the beginning of something even more difficult to face? The days that followed the billionaire's fall were heavy with change he could not escape. No matter how many times he tried to bury his guilt in the depths of his crumbling empire, the world saw him as a cautionary tale, a man whose hubris had led to his undoing. And perhaps, for the first time in years, he truly saw himself the same way. The silence of his life now echoed louder than any success he had once achieved. The phone calls stopped, the meetings ceased, and his name was only whispered in disapproval. It was a humbling experience, but there was something about it, something about the absolute loss, that forced him to look inward. The arrogance he had worn like a shield had fallen away, and in its place, something softer began to emerge. Remorse. He couldn't undo the damage he'd caused. His wealth, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a reminder of his failures. But what remained was his ability to change, to try and right the wrongs he had inflicted on others. Redemption didn't come in the form of money or status. It came in the quiet, painful moments of self-reflection. And so, he began. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, he reached out to the people he had wronged. The business partners he had discarded in his rise to the top were now his focus, though they were reluctant to even listen. Still, he pressed on, acknowledging his past mistakes, offering apologies where they were due, and showing in every action that he had learned something. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he owed it to himself to try. For Sarah, the weight of her years of sacrifice had finally begun to lift. It wasn't easy, not by a long shot, but for the first time, she felt the freedom that had been denied her for so long. The sense of closure was not immediate, nor was it perfect. There were still days when she would think of the past, when her heart would ache for the loss of a life she could never return to. But she had endured, and now, with the truth revealed, she could move forward. She found peace not in vengeance, but in the knowledge that she had reclaimed her dignity. She had stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent, and though she had lost much, she had gained something far more valuable: herself. In the months that followed, she rebuilt her life, no longer defined by the billionaire's cruelty. She found a sense of belonging in new friendships, new opportunities, and in rediscovering the parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of fear and silence for so long. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was hers. She was free to live it on her terms. The billionaire, too, began to rebuild. Not an empire this time, but his own humanity. He sought out counsel, not to rebuild his fortune, but to heal the emotional wounds that had festered for so long. It was a slow process, perhaps the slowest he had ever endured, but it was real. And in that painful journey, he started to learn the true cost of arrogance and greed. Neither of them would ever be the same again, but maybe that was the point. Sometimes life didn't offer do-overs. Sometimes you had to make amends for your past before you could even hope for a future. As Sarah stood by the window of her small apartment, watching the sun set over the city, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had lived through the worst of it and come out the other side stronger than she ever imagined possible. And for the first time in a long while, she believed that tomorrow could be better. The billionaire, in his quiet solitude, understood that his journey was far from over. But he had taken the first step, a step toward redemption. And for the first time, he could face the future, not with fear, but with the hope that he could change, that there was still room for him to grow. The story of their lives was no longer just one of betrayal and suffering. It had become a story of healing, of the possibility that, even in the darkest moments, there was always a chance for redemption. And maybe, just maybe, that was the truest kind of victory.